What if you're a moderately aggressive investor and you're targeting a 7% return, but your dollar cost averaging, so maybe you get 5, then shave off 3%, you're gonna net 2% per annum? Is that really gonna get you ready for retirement? You got no chance.
Hey Vince, thanks so much for joining me on the video chat today. Just for everyone listening, can you just give us a quick intro about what you do?
Hi Clark, thanks for having me. My name is Vince Truong. I live in Dubai. I've been here for almost 13 years, coming from California. I'm a fee-based certified financial planner. I help American expats around the world basically grow their wealth by managing their portfolios directly. And I also sort of help them have a roadmap for the future, giving them guidance on what they need to do today to sort of secure their ideal future tomorrow.
Gotcha. Hey, Vince, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because, we've referred a few people to you in the past. Well, probably more than a few now after all the years we've been going. We've always had great feedback. And I guess today, for people who are kind of new to this, what mistakes do you kind of see Americans making when it comes to investments? Because by the time they usually get to us and it comes to dealing with their US tax returns, we're kind of cleaning up the mess, of things that they've done, which had they had known better, they wouldn't have done at all. So I'm just wondering if you can give us a little bit of insight into what some of those mistakes are that you see most common and how people can steer around them.
Sure. So I've got, I think, 5 common mistakes that American expats make. Great. Some are related to tax and some are just things they should know or try to avoid. The first one is for those who have not gone overseas yet, who are still in the US but are planning to go overseas, they need to be moving their investments into a platform provider that is friendly to expats. And the reason why that matters is a simple thing like most financial accounts these days, to log in, you need 2-factor authentication. And sometimes that's done through a cell phone or a mobile phone. And some of the companies don't allow for non-US phone numbers. And so a little thing like that is very practical, but you might have trouble logging into your account because you don't have a US cell phone number anymore. And so you need to work with companies that are accommodative of people living around the world. And also because some companies, for instance, Merrill Lynch, have closed down business altogether to American expats or anyone living overseas. Some allow you to keep your accounts, but they won't open new accounts for you.
That's right.
Like say, for instance, an E-Trade or a Vanguard or a Fidelity. So the two that I think you should really consider moving your accounts to before you leave the country would be Charles Schwab and Interactive Brokers, because they have a large international footprint.
Brilliant. It's such an interesting point because really the US tax code is written in a way to really encourage Americans abroad to send their money home and invest it at home. So that's why they make some US tax forms so onerous and annoying to fill in or expensive if you're paying to have it done.
Yep.
But then on the flip side, you've got all these investment houses in the US that are so hard to deal with when you're living abroad. It's just this bizarre no man's land in the middle, right?
Right. It's because they don't want the compliance headache, So, the US is so onerous on regulations and compliance, and that just makes it more difficult for expats to, just have a simple thing like an investment account. But again, Interactive Brokers and Charles Schwab, they're both quite global, both very friendly. I mean, simple things like, again, having an SMS sent to an international cell phone number. It works with those two providers. The second thing I was thinking about is, I've got American clients who went overseas to work, and, it always that typical story. They think they'll stay for 2 years and it ends up being like 10 years. And then, once you've been abroad for a while, you don't feel like you fit into America anymore. And you might very well consider retiring overseas. And it might not be the country where you're working at, but yet you don't see yourself going back to the US. So what happens there is, what I don't see people doing is planning for retirement in an overseas environment where you got to think about, what is Social Security or Medicare going to look like, or how much do I need to be saving today to fund a retirement in this country with this cost of living, with this level of taxation? Are they going to tax my US investments? Do they have a double tax treaty with the US? And what is their currency compared to the dollar? And how do I see currency movements in the future? So you need to really know or be thinking about what you need to be saving today to sort of give yourself the greatest chance of being able to have an enjoyable retirement in the country where you want to be, currency adjusted and adjusted for the nuances of that country.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I'm sure for some people, if they wanted to retire in Dubai, you'd probably need a lot more money than certain places in the United States, right? If you want a comfortable, fun retirement.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, depending on where in the US you're coming from. I come from Orange County, California. To be honest, cost of living is not that different. Yeah, Dubai cost of living has actually come down. I actually think about retiring in Dubai because they do allow retirement visas now under certain scenarios, like for instance, buying a home. But, I've had a client who retired recently in Spain and he was working in Bahrain. And he talks about how the cost of his medical insurance is the same as he would pay for Medicare Part B and Part C and Part D in America anyway. So really, it's not that huge of a difference. And he's very, very happy there on a much lower cost of living, even adjusted for a relatively strong euro right now.
So it's all pros and cons, right? So it's really just about doing that research.
Most people don't really think too hard about retirement, right? And the problem with that is time becomes your enemy the closer you get to that date. When you have plenty of time, time is obviously in your favor. You have time to compound and grow your wealth. But when it comes closer and you haven't done any planning, well, now you might be in a lot of trouble. The key thing is you need to know your magic number. And the magic number is not, hey, I need this size nest egg to fund my lifestyle. That's what people think the magic number is.
Yeah.
The real magic number from my perspective is around client behavior. And from that perspective, the real magic number is what do you need to set aside each month today to meet your objective in the future? That's the real magic number. You should know that number. And if possible, save that amount before you do any other kind of discretionary spending.
I think it was Robert Kiyosaki there who said, it takes time to retire. I think that's what he was referring to. It's the planning, right? And kind of getting ready in advance.
The human mind likes to grasp for simple rules of thumb, right? And so a simple rule of thumb is to simply know I need to save X amount every month and invest it before I do anything else. So you need to know what that number is.
We should get together, Vince, and maybe do another video on how much money do you need to retire? Because it's a subject all in its own right. And I think the other thing is a lot of people forget to consider inflation. If you're not thinking about retiring for 20, 30 years, even if you worked out that you wanted $1 million today, well, in 20, 30 years, well, that's $2-3 million. And you need to have that ready by then.
That's a very good point, Clark, because inflation is sort of the hot topic right now in financial markets. And we've had over 2 decades of very unnaturally low inflation of around 2% in developed countries, which is not likely to continue going forward. And so, it's going to be a bit of sticker shock, except for much older generations who can remember 15% inflation in the early 80s. But for those of us who weren't old enough to remember that, we're used to being, 2% inflation is not that big of a deal, but it's probably not going to be 2% going forward. So the third thing I was thinking about, and this is more for people who are going to be living in countries where their overall tax liability is going to be lower than it would be simply paying their U.S. taxes, right? So those people, they're going to be, for instance, obviously the Gulf would be one region because we don't have income tax out here. But there are jurisdictions, maybe not Europe, but that have lower tax bandings than the U.S. And in that case, your U.S. tax liability is going to be higher than your local tax liability. And from that perspective, you want to maximize the allowances that the U.S. provides. And so one of those, everybody is probably familiar with the foreign earned income exclusion. What is it, like 108,700 this year, roughly around there. But the thing that people forget about is the housing allowance. And they don't maximize that. And what I mean by that is in many places with many expat contracts, so in other words, not where you're working with a local contract, but you're working with an expat contract, maybe an international, multinational company. Anyway, you should be negotiating to make sure that the housing allowance is spelled out and not simply included in, say, your base salary. Because if it's not spelled out and it's not like sort of, something given to you as a separate housing allowance, you're missing out on that potential exclusion to save you tax money.
Yeah, it's so important to max it out, isn't it? And the best way to do that is just with planning it out in advance.
If you live in the US your entire life, you may or may not be used to even thinking about what you wouldn't even be thinking about in a housing allowance, much less like really trying to negotiate the specifics of a contract. But at least in the GCC, I find companies are quite flexible in allowing you to negotiate something specific like a housing allowance. And that just lowers sort of their pension liability anyway if you have a lower base salary. So be sure to negotiate the employment contract to maximize the housing allowance where appropriate. The fourth thing that I see expats doing is many are familiar with the idea that they probably shouldn't be in foreign investments, specifically foreign mutual funds, PFICs, passive foreign investment companies. Most people have an inkling that they shouldn't do that. And so they'll keep it to, say, US investments, US stocks, US ETFs. The problem is in some jurisdictions, especially, for instance, Europe, US ETFs are not allowed because they don't follow European regulations for investments called UCITS, UCITS. And so they don't qualify. And so if you have, say, an investment account, say, with Schwab, and you live in Europe, you can't buy a US ETF, okay?
Yep.
You can have the ones that you already have, but once you sell it, you cannot buy it again. But the thing is, you can't buy the European mutual funds or ETFs either because A, they may not be permissible on the platform. Schwab certainly would not in most cases. Interactive brokers probably would. But the problem is now you're an American holding a PFIC. So the Europeans don't want American ETFs and the Americans don't want European ETFs. They're just stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so what do you do then? Well, first off, if you have any American ETFs already and you're thinking you might sell it, you need to think really hard whether you really want to sell it. Because if you do, going forward, you're going to be stuck just buying all basically individual stocks. And that's a lot more sort of cumbersome in terms of portfolio management. So hang on to your US ETFs. And also, let's say you're in the UK. There are some American ETFs that do reporting to HMRC and therefore qualify for UK capital gains tax, which is, I believe, 20%. If you're in a higher tax banding, say 40%, you want to pay the capital gains tax rate. But if you don't hold the ETFs that report to HMRC, you're going to pay the income tax rate at 40 versus the capital gains rate at 20. So just be very mindful of the ETFs that are permissible and acceptable in the country where you're living.
We rarely see people doing this in their research phase, and we usually see people doing this after the fact. They've already bought something, done something, which they then have to undo. And, there's always charges and fees that go along with undoing it. And on top, you mentioned PFICs. The cost of filing PFICs on the US tax return is just yucky. It's expensive and it's cumbersome, and clients certainly don't like being charged for it.
The last thing I was going to mention related to actually PFICs is, and again, this is very much dependent on where you are in the world. I see this more in emerging markets, so the GCC and Asia, but basically it's when you get a lot of financial advisors who don't really know how to work with Americans. I've been around for a long time. I've met literally hundreds of people in my industry. And in the emerging markets, they tend to not be professional. They tend to be salespeople of financial products. And so everybody wants to tap into the American expat market. So they try to find solutions for Americans that they then market towards Americans. Gosh, I mean, we could go on for an hour on this topic. I'm going to try to keep this simple. But basically, the bottom line is most of these products, we don't have clear IRS guidance because, as we all know, they've been understaffed. Probably that's going to change going forward. Maybe we're going to see more staffing. Maybe we're going to see more audits going forward. Who knows? But, they haven't, I don't think, had the time to really sink their teeth into some of the products that get marketed to American expats. So some of these revolve around the US-Malta tax treaty, so pensions based out of Malta. Some of these are sort of offshore Channel Island-based investments like regular savings plans sold through insurance companies. And I mean, again, we can go on for an hour about the filing of these things, but let me keep it real simple. Forget about the tax for a second. If you don't understand the charges on these products, you should not sign into them. And most advisors themselves do not understand the charges. And if they did, they don't necessarily want to tell you. It'll be maybe in a suitability report. They're not going to really emphasize it. But if you do the math, it's a very, very bad idea, because think about it this way. It's going to get pitched as an alternative to saving in a pension, because you can't save in a 401k, right? And by the way, make sure you're saving to an IRA if you have qualified earned income. But if not, they're going to pitch it as a pension. And so you're going to save on a monthly basis, right? When you save money on a monthly basis like you would in a 401k, the problem is you're never really going to get the return that the market gets, especially in the early years. Because, simple example, if the market did 10% one year and you put money in January 1 and you put money in on July 1, and both of them are taking the same risk as the market. So the first tranche on January 1 is going to get 10%. The second tranche, assuming like an equal return, is going to get, say, 5% because it's only had 6 months to be invested. What's your portfolio return? It's going to be about 7.3, 7.4%. So simply because you've added new funds, you cannot get the market return. If you're saving on a regular basis in a pension, you already struggle with the math of dollar cost averaging. The problem is this. These products typically will cost about 3% per annum, depending on the product. Could be lower, it could be higher. What if you're a moderately aggressive investor and you're targeting a 7% return, but your dollar cost averaging, so maybe you get 5, then shave off 3%, you're going to net 2% per annum? Is that really going to get you ready for retirement? You got no chance. I've written so many posts on this. It really gets to me. I get really passionate about this. Anyway, avoid them, or at least you better know what you're paying. And it better make sense.
Get some help, right?
Yeah. Because why not just open a U.S. account? And they're going to give you reasons why you can and cannot, whatever. But I think those are 5 things. So I'll just recap real quick. Make sure you're going to be working with a company that is friendly towards expats once you move overseas. You need to take care of that before you leave. You need to know what your magic number is for retirement, adjust it for the place you might end up, and adjust it for currency and cost of living. So know what amount needs to be saved every month, and do that before you do any other kind of discretionary expenditure. Where appropriate, negotiate your employment contract to make sure you maximize the housing allowance. Don't forget the housing allowance. Know what investments are acceptable and permissible in the jurisdiction where you're at. Don't sell US ETFs that you can't buy back later. And then lastly, don't sign up for any non-US investment platforms or products without understanding all of the built-in charges.
Oh, that's brilliant, Vince. That's going to really help people. I think at least for a few people, it'll send off a few light bulbs or raise a few question marks for those who haven't got started yet. This can be really beneficial. And those who have started, they might go and start looking through their portfolios to see what they actually have and see if, you can go and start finding out what PFICs are and things like that. Vince, that's been so helpful. If people want to get some help from you, how can they go about that?
Yeah, I do offer a free initial consultation, and you can just fill out the form at the bottom of this video, and I'll reach back out to you.
Brilliant. Vince, thanks so much for your time today. And let's catch up in a few weeks, and let's talk about how much money you need to retire.
Okay, will do.
Thanks, Vince. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.